Hi students, welcome to HSC Earth and Environmental Science and Module 8 on Resource Management. This is video number 10. We're going to start having a little bit more of an in-depth look at some of the ways of managing solid waste. Our long intention for this video is to be able to outline some of the management options for different types of solid waste. We're fresh from our school waste audit, so we know the sorts of stuff that's being thrown into the bins at our school. But what we want to try and do now is to see if we can look at the longer picture. What's actually happening to these different types of wastes? How effectively are they being treated or dealt with? And what are some of the potential outcomes for each of these different types of solid waste? So the first thing to do is to have a little bit of a look at some of the different types of solid waste. Now remember that some of these can be part of the normal recycling. So we can recycle when the recycle collections come in. Paper and cardboard, often glass and metals also fit into the recycling. And sometimes plastics too will also be part of our recycling. You might be somewhere where you get your organic waste collected, or where there's somewhere where you can have that collected, or you might even be doing something like composting, which is something we'll talk about as a potential way of treating this sort of form of solid waste. E-waste is something that's actually on the increase. Obviously, our lives are much more dominated by technology than they used to be, and a lot of that technology is technology that's constantly being updated or replaced. So think of things like mobile phones, for example. And there's an awful lot of material that goes into making mobile phones, some of which obviously does link back into our metals, but we don't always recover each of those individual components from, say, something like a mobile phone or an iPad, MacBook, anything like that. Often what happens is these things get discarded. Once they get slow, a bit older, what are we doing with the materials that are going into each of these different types of waste? Well, most of what we're doing is we're throwing it out in landfill. And even if you think about something that's very common like pizza boxes, pizza obviously is quite a popular dinner choice. But the problem with the pizza box is whilst it's made of cardboard, so therefore it should seem like a good candidate for recycling. Unfortunately, most of the time the pizza box is so contaminated with the foods, with the oils from the cooking, that they can't be effectively recycled, which means they'll end up in landfill. So what are some of the management options that we've got to deal with all these different types of solid waste? Well, the one that we're going to focus on a little bit is sanitary landfill. Now, sanitary landfill is an update on the old way that they used to do things, and I'll talk about that in a few moments. And then I want to very briefly cover each of these other four options: incineration, recovery and recycling, composting, and pyrolysis. And I've already talked a little bit about composting, but this is something that we're going to be looking at in just a little bit more detail. So let's get the picture pretty clearly. These are some figures from 2016 to 2019. So they're a little bit out of date, but not too bad. And you can see that what we've had is something that's sort of holding over that 3-year period in terms of the amount of waste that we were contributing to landfill. There's a little bit of an increase, so this is a nice trend. That's actually slightly increasing the amount of our solid waste that is actually being recycled. Small amount in energy recovery, and it's pretty stable. It's not changing too much, and we'll look at some of that. Some of our waste is being exported. You might not believe it, but it is. Again, it's holding at a pretty consistent kind of a level, and not much of anything else there. So you can see that some of the key things that we need to focus in terms of solid waste, the majority of what we throw in our garbage bins is either going to be recycled or it's going to end up in landfill. So here's the problem with landfill, and I have to say landfill is now much more successful than it used to be. It was basically nothing more really than just dig a hole in the ground and chuck all your stuff that you don't want in it. Cover it over with a little bit of soil and maybe you won't see it, you'll forget about it and not worry. The problem, of course, with that is that it rains, water can come through the site, it can dissolve certain materials that are in the waste, it can wash other materials away, or it can leach them. So this Leachate is the material that's actually moving down with water. So when it rains and the water starts to percolate through the layers of soil, it's going to pick up some materials with it, and it's going to take them down. Sometimes it's going to take them down to the water table. So where our groundwater is. So I'll just make that groundwater. So this is our groundwater. Should be relatively good, but the problem with it is that this leachate can contribute some significantly concerning materials into this groundwater. So we can have elevated iron concentrations, so that just means that the water can be saltier, more saline, and of course that can have some implications too if the water table rises and some of that salt then gets deposited into the upper layers, potentially too into the surface layers. More of a problem is heavy metals, particularly things like lead ions. Lead ions can have been linked to brain disorders. So leads and other heavy metals like cadmium, arsenic, these are really significant problems. And if they are in our water supplies, then they can have quite a significant detrimental effect on the environment and on people in the area. And they can do this down into the parts per million. So they don't have to be very high concentrations, and they can have a very significant effect on life. There's another little group of compounds which are organic compounds. They're kind of more general, or I guess more precise name is the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. That's what the PAH stands for. These are organic compounds that again have maybe links as carcinogens, so cancer-causing agents. And again, they can leach out of the landfill as the water moves through and can, again, contaminate this groundwater. So, and that's the way we used to do it, but it's not the way that we do it anymore. What we try and do now is we try and create seals underneath our landfill, and we try and make sure that they are what's going into the landfill is much better isolated, so that we're not going to get this leaching happening. We're not going to get this material that's going to be moving from one site down through the soil layers into our groundwater supply. We're going to have a look in class at a couple of little examples of different types of sanitary landfill, but the basic idea is that we want to try and protect our groundwater supplies from any contamination as a result of landfill. And so this nicely brings us to these other types of sustainable waste management. And what we're going to do in these next couple of videos is have a little bit of a look at some of the various ways that we've looked at trying to deal with particularly solid waste and how we might manage that solid waste in a sustainable way. But there were 4 other options that we talked about in addition to sanitary landfill. The first of those is incineration, and incineration, a lot of, if you talk to your grandparents, they probably remember times where a lot of houses had incinerators in their backyards. People would just used to go out and just burn stuff, basically. So burning things is great. It reduces them down to ash. So what we end up with is just ash, which greatly reduces the volume of waste that you have. If you can just burn stuff, then you get this big pile of stuff. Think about, paper and cardboard, most obvious things, and you've got all these boxes and things, and then you burn them and they come down to a small pile of ashes. So we're significantly reducing the volume if we do something like incineration. But we're doing that at the cost of the air quality. So the problem with burning a lot of these things, quite apart from the fact that some of them actually contained carcinogens, particular chemicals that may have had adverse effects on our brains, on our lungs, they were also contributing to pollution in the atmosphere, so particulate matter particularly, things like, well, we'll call it soot, but particles, little tiny fine particles of carbon often floating off into the atmosphere. And of course, they were also contributing things like carbon dioxide to our problems associated with greenhouse gases. So what's another option? Well, another option is recovery and recycling. So we want to try and see if there are ways that we can recover some of the material that would have otherwise been thrown out or end up in our landfill, and see if there's another way of using it. See if we can clean material up and reuse it. Again, this has the impact of reducing the total volume of rubbish. Now, maybe all it does is delay the inevitable, so there's a level of acceptance with recycling that maybe all we're doing is throwing things away another day. But what this can also do is it can also have an effect on reduced production. So obviously we don't need quite so many phones if we keep our phones for a little longer. If we had a way of recycling them, reusing them, maybe we wouldn't need to produce them in such quite high numbers. And of course, there's a lot of processes, a lot of industrial processes where production is linked to things like generation of greenhouse gases. So there can be flow-on effects associated with this as well if we're able to do this effectively on a large scale. A special option that's available for organic wastes, green wastes, is composting, so controlled biodegradable breakdown. So obviously things must be biodegradable. They must be able to be attacked successfully by living organisms, usually things like bacteria or a fungus, those sorts of stuff. They can break down the material, and that often produces quite a high quality compost. So this has significant agricultural benefits. If we can do this on large scales, we can maybe use these as fertilizers and turn some of this material back into the soil. Methane gas generation can also be a byproduct of composting. Now, we know that methane gas is a greenhouse gas, so it's one of our greenhouse gases. So we know that's not ideal, but it could also be used for some energy generation. We'll have a look at that in a future video. But if it does take the place, I guess, of some of the fuels that we're currently using for energy generation, then there's a potential positive in methane gas generation as well. And the last is pyrolysis. So this is basically breakdown with fire, breakdown with heat. It's usually to distinguish it from incineration. This one is an anaerobic process, so no oxygen. So the idea with pyrolysis is you're trying to break down the wastes, but you're doing it in the absence of oxygen. No oxygen. And one of the things that you need in order to do that is to have relatively high pressures and temperatures. You obviously need to be ensuring that your containers are well sealed, because obviously there's oxygen everywhere. And again, this has a similar sort of impact to the sort of things that we saw with incineration. We get a nice reduction in our volumes, but again, what we're doing is we're often producing small volume solids. We may even be producing some liquids and potentially some gases as well as a result of this process. And the consequence of that is that we end up, or at least potentially we could end up, increasing the pollution that we're releasing as a result of these processes. So this is a little range of some of the waste management processes associated with dealing with all of the solid waste that we're throwing away every day, and how we might be able to better manage all of that waste. As we continue to grow as populations around the world, we're going to continue to produce more and more waste. So we're going to have some effective ways of dealing with this. And to start looking at some of the various methods that we've got for dealing with waste, we're going to have to investigate a few of these in future videos. Thanks for watching.